Good morning and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Devorah Margolin, and I am a senior research fellow here at the program on extremism at George Washington University. I am excited to welcome you all here today to join us in our latest launch of the ISIS Files digital repository. We are joined today by two excellent speakers who will be talking about our newest batch of files, which focus on the Department of Dawa and Mosques. First, we are joined by Dr. Aaron Zelin, who is the Richard Borrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a visiting research scholar at Brandeis University. Dr. Zelin's research focuses on Sunni Arab jihadi groups in North Africa and Syria, as well as foreign fighters and online jihadism and jihadi governance. He's also the author of a recently released book, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad, with Columbia University Press, the founder of the widely acclaimed and widely cited jihadiology.net and its podcast, Jihad Pod, and the author of today's ISIS Files report, My Beloved Brothers in God, This is an Invitation, the Islamic State's Dawa and Mosque Administration. We are also joined today by Dr. Nellie Lahoud, a senior fellow at New America's International Security Program, who's currently writing a book about the Abbottabad papers and that were recovered by the US Special Forces and is a Minerva-funded project. Dr. Lahoud's research has focused on the evolution of the ideology of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. She's also published on women's roles in ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the use of a cappella by these two groups in their media output. Thank you for joining us today. Additionally, for those of you who have not yet had the chance, please check out our website, isisfiles.gwu.edu, where you can find the report that Aaron's about to present on, as well as the 19 primary source files that were used to corroborate it. Aaron, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. First off, before I start talking about the paper itself, I just wanted to thank Rukmini Kalamaki, who is the one who actually retrieved the files from IS's buildings within Iraq. So we wouldn't be able to do this research without that. Obviously, I want to thank the program on extremism for asking me to write this paper on the Dawa and Mosques Administration. And then whoever the two anonymous reviewers are, I appreciate the feedback. It definitely helped out the paper in the end. So since the founding of the Islamic State and its predecessor groups in 1999, the use of Dawa has only been a priority for the group's repertoire of activities, really, in its territory since it's operated in beginning in 2013. In its early years, when the group was then calling itself Jund al-Sham, when it was based in Afghanistan, much of its focus was on training camps. And in its initial years in Iraq, the focus was on terrorism and insurgency. And even when it claimed to be a state in October 2006, its two initial cabinets set up in April 2007 and September 2009 did not contain a ministry related specifically to Dawa. Therefore, this research explores how this began to change with the Islamic State when it entered Syria in 2013 and how it then played out as it built itself up towards the revival of its self-proclaimed caliphate and what it meant in the context of its governance and state building project. To better understand this aspect of how IS attempted to garner support and promote its interpretations of Islam, this paper that I wrote also explored important background on Dawa itself, the jihadi movement and Dawa, how IS began to implement its use of it prior to the Caliphate announcement, how this was then propagated by IS in its official media productions following the announcement, and then concluding looking at sort of on the ground how it was being used based off of these administrative documents. Of course, due to the time constraints of this talk, I won't get into every single aspect of it. It is a 49-page report, so those that are interested, I definitely recommend reading through it all, since I'll primarily just be focusing on what IS specifically did when it started conducting things and pointing out a few examples here and there. But if you want more details, I definitely would suggest reading the thing in full. In addition to the typical primary sources utilized in such research, I was able to use 19 files from Program and Extremism ISIS Files digital repository. They came from the Diwan al-Dawa al-Masajid, or the Mosques and Dawa administration in Wilayat Nineveh and Wilayat al-Jazeera, in parts of north and western Iraq, which spanned the time period of September 22nd, 2014 to August 28th, 2016. An interest in Dawa began to take on more importance only mere months after the second cabinet was formed, which I alluded to. Similar to Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State did in fact also internalize lessons from the group's own actions that led to the Sahwa movement in Iraq against it. However, according to IS's own internal write-up on this in around December 2009, January 2010, called the Fallujah Memorandum, it did not take any blame for itself, and unlike Al-Qaeda, which began to curtail excessive use of violence and focus on regaining the trust of local populations, IS concluded that their experiences are, quote, why the Mujahideen no longer abide by the preferences of the people, but rather abide by their objective to satisfy God's will, end quote. At the end of the Fallujah Memorandum, it did note that, quote, the Ministry of Legal Committees should also set plans and goals for Dawa to spread the Salafi manhaj or methodology. And then quoting Mawardi said, a state can be established by the strength and power of resources such as money or by the power of religion. The latter is more stable, end quote. Those two last quotes might appear contradictory, but it makes sense from IS's perspective. Unlike Al-Qaeda, which sees its relationship with the local population through the lens of reciprocity, even if AQ has the ultimate administrative authority when it is in charge of a particular area, IS is fully totalitarian. IS sees the local population as subjects, and that, quote, mistakes occur when the Mujahideen were worried about the will and happiness of the people rather than the will and pleasure of God. That being said, to implement the will of God, IS's subjects must heed its interpretations of Islam, and therefore Dawa is necessary so the populace knows and understands it. But taking part in Dawa for IS is not in relation to building political legitimacy as AQ-related groups see it, because IS's self-declared caliphate, from its perspective, is ordained by God. The Diwan al-Dawa al-Masajid is one of 14 administrations of IS's bureaucracy, whereby these administrations claim to assume the maintenance of public interests and protect the people's religion and security. The Diwan's main function is concerned with the call of God and implementing it, preparing and appointing imams and preachers, holding preparatory seminars and Sharia courses, and building and preparing mosques. An IS administrative report in the Ramadi Belt sector dated May to June 2015 and retrieved by Ayman al-Tamimi provides insights into how the administration was set up locally and what its officials in that administrative duties were in carrying out the strategic directives of the administration mentioned above. According to it, this local aspect of the administration had an office emir, a deputy emir, an administrative official, a mosques official, an assistant mosque official, a Dawa official, assistant Dawa official, and media official. The report also provides insights into how IS might translate its activities on the ground and then later use it for its online propaganda. One of the directives for that month in the report by the office emir was to remove what remains of the practices of innovations in the mosques. The report then notes that the mosques official removed innovations from the following mosques: Al-Shuhada, Al-Tawheed, Al-Hussein, Al-Hassan al-Basri, and Al-Salahin. Finally, later in the report, it says that the media official took pictures of the changes that occurred at the Al-Hassan al-Basri mosque. This was done possibly to confirm that it happened to the media official superiors, but more likely since the individual was a media official for use in propaganda that IS would later post online to show it was not only talking the talk, but walking the walk as well. This report also could highlight that although IS allegedly made changes at a number of mosques, the media official only took photos at one in particular, illustrating that even though we know that IS has had such a large online repository of propaganda over the years, not everything it did locally was necessarily documented for a broader global audience. While 13 of the 19 ISIS files are copies of sermons given at mosques in Wilayat Ninawa and Wilayat Al Jazeera, one in particular is worth highlighting. This is a good example of how IS introduced Dawa to locals. This sermon was on inviting people to the ways of Islam and following God's edicts. And it took place in the Rashidiyya neighborhood of Mosul on an unknown date. The sermon provides a series of du'at or invitations to those listening to the speech, which the individual that would have performed the sermon summed it up by saying, quote, "In short, it is an invitation to know God, a knowledge that makes you fear him and love him," end quote. It concludes by telling its audiences in relation to understanding the truth of this word through Kitab Allah or the Quran by saying, quote, "My brother, Come with me for a tour. I hope the impatient won't see it as too long and the busy won't see it too distracting. Let us roam around the universe with its heavens, its earth, and its living things, confident and mindful, end quote. This showcases that in private, IS is not always brutish. It also provides greater depth in understanding why one might become interested in joining IS or not viewing them as bad as someone from the outside might construe. Of course, there are myriad of instances in IS propaganda that they themselves show off of their own sadistic and ghoulish imaginations. But for someone locally that might have hardship in life or some form of grievance, this could provide the opening whereby that individual then seeks redemption through religion, which IS is harnessing for its broader societal project. There was a small item in the ISIS files that gave us insights into how IS prepared mosques. It describes supplies needed at the Abu Hamza al-Muhajir Mosque in the village of Al-Quba, 11 miles southwest of Talkaif, in Wilayat Nineveh on December 23rd, 2015. It notes that, quote, the mosque's needs of furniture would be supplied exclusively from churches, end quote. This would confirm reports from the ISIS files when cross-referencing with its Diwan al-Aqarat wal-Kharaj, or the Real Estate and Land Tax Administration operation, which Ayman al-Tamimi already analyzed on the ISIS files website and concluded that ISIS viewed Christian property to be ISIS real estate. This highlights how IS might have furnished other newly built mosques or other Islamic-related institutions such as centers and schools. Unfortunately, within the files itself, there is nothing related to women's involvement in IS's Dawa apparatus. If there had been more than 19 files, it's plausible that there could have been more. That being said, a famous Telegram channel, for those that follow this in the weeds, Al-Nadir al-Uriyan, or the Bear Warner, which has criticized IS from the more extreme angle for supposedly having lost its way, has leaked internal IS documents on a variety of topics in recent years, including on controversies related to women's Dawa within IS, which provides some insight into some of its operations. According to the channel, the core of IS's women's Dawa institutions, at least in Syria, were based in Raqqa and Tabqa, with the latter area being filled with foreign women involved in such activities. One of the main centers of women's Dawa was called Mahad Dat al-Nitakin, or She of the Two Belts Institute, which was run by Dr. Iman Mustafa al-Bagha. Prior to joining IS, al-Bagha received her doctorate in fiqh, or jurisprudence, and usul fiqh, principles of jurisprudence from the University of Damascus, and then worked as a lecturer while also doing Dawa at Al-Malik Faisal University in Dammam, Saudi Arabia for 25 years. According to an IS biography of her in its Kisat al-Mujahid series, once she joined IS, she also helped with studies in the Diwan al-Bahuth wal-Iftar, or the Research and Religious Legal Opinions Administration, worked with the women's Hizbah activities such as Katibat al-Khansa, and focused on research such as al-Wala wal-Bara, or loyalty and disavowal, and shirk, polytheism. The That al-Nitakin Institute had 6 teachers on staff, including al-Bagha, who lectured on 11 subjects. And the Institute maintained 4 levels of teaching with the following number of students for each level. The first was 200 female students, the second was 70 female students, the third was 50 female students, and the fourth, 30 female students. However, due to controversy surrounding al-Bagha's views on takfir or lack thereof, she was sacked from her position as director of this institute and would then be shuttered. This similarly happened with a rogue women's Dawa institute set up in Tabqa by Hamam al-Tunisiya, who was also perceived to be not strict enough in her views on takfir related to groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra. That led to internal discord between those that followed the likes of al-Bagha and al-Tunisiya versus the ultra extremists within IS. In the end, this led to the women's Dawa within IS only being done within the mosques via its Diwan al-Dawa al-Masajid and not ostensibly its self-maintained institutes. This highlights that the issues over doctrine that plagued the men of the Islamic State, which Cole Bunzel examined within the IS files, which is also on the website, also occurred within the context of the women's activism within IS too. What is noteworthy when you look at the files as a whole is that what IS was doing locally resembled what it said it was doing via its online media architecture. Of course, it would be unwise to generalize this to all aspects of IS's bureaucracy and its administration, but at least in terms of these particular activities, one can gain deep insights into IS's apparatus from the primary sources it releases, which reinforces the importance of them in the study of jihadism, especially its Arabic language content, since that is where the vast majority of its corpus lies. Related to this, the ISIS files and other administrative documents show the direct operational importance of IS's in-theater Dawa program and how it far outstrips that of its virtual outreach online. In part, this is because it has a much greater audience and control things in a greater detail locally on a day-to-day basis in people's lives that are under IS's writ due to its totalitarian system at the time. I'll leave it there since we only have limited time, but I just want to give a little flavor of it, and hopefully you'll read the paper in full, since there's a lot of more details about the history, how Al-Qaeda perceived of this, as well as more specifics on IS and how it built up these operations before the Caliphate announcement as well as after. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate that. I'd also like to remind our audience that there is a Q&A function, and to please begin to throw some questions into there. And after our presenters speak, I will begin to curate a discussion with the questions that are added. Nelly, I'd like to throw it to you. Thank you. Nelly, I think you have to unmute. Apologies. There you go.
Is that working? Okay, so let me thank you once again for the invitation, and that it is very nice to be presenting with Aaron today. I just want to correct one thing that you said, Deborah, at the beginning. My research today is forthcoming in a Minerva-funded project led by Tony Lemieux at Georgia State, but my Abbottabad paper project is a New America project. I wanted to study the evolution of jihadi media through a pre-9/11 lens. The literature on the subject is very rich, but is largely conditioned by a post-9/11 vantage point, during which the digital presence of jihadi groups proliferated. From that perspective, jihadis are often credited with having had the foresight to develop a sophisticated media strategy. Viewed strictly from a post-9/11 lens, we would agree with Marshall McLuhan's framework that the medium is the message. But an historical examination suggests otherwise. I studied Al-Qaeda's internal documents from the late 1980s. I had access to these documents through the CTC at West Point, and I believe they will be releasing them next year. And the Abbottabad papers, which I have also been working on for a while. And my main conclusion is that before 9/11, jihadis relied on the mainstream media to promote their causes. After 9/11, jihadi media developed out of necessity. That is when the mainstream media denied jihadis the ability to shape their own narrative. I did not start with the jihadis. Instead, my starting point was with Hassan al-Banna's Dawa wa Da'iyah, and that's why I'm presenting with Aaron today, because it fits in with the theme that he wrote about in his report. I'll be brief about the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'd be happy to say more during the Q&A. But I want to say that by definition and by design, Dawa is as much about the act of spreading the creed as it is about the content of the creed. It encompasses two sides in interaction with one another. On the initiating side, there is a da'i or da'iyah, he or she who invites others to Islam. On the receiving end are those who are invited to join Islam. An important feature of the Islamists' da'wah is that it was largely focused on Muslims rather than non-Muslims. Al-Banna and those in his circle spread the da'wah through one-on-one and one-on-many preaching in schools, mosques, and cafes, and in prisons when they got imprisoned. The preachers probably did not realize that they were engaged in a media strategy campaign per se. Their teachings grew organically, gradually, and successfully. In the words of Al-Banna, Dawa is comparable to a fertile seed. It always bears fruit wherever it is planted. It was the success of the non-electronic media that led to the adoption of the print media in the forms of pamphlets, magazines, and newspapers. And later the electronic media, first with cassettes, radio, television, and videos, and then the internet and social media. When I looked at the early Dawa activities of the Brotherhood, the terms tarbiyah, education, thaqafa, culture were prevalent. Very little about a'lam or media. It's understandable. The Dawa of the Brotherhood began as an anti-colonial project that was as much about liberating what they perceived to be the colonized Muslim mind as it was against the colonizers. When then does media emerge? We start coming across media or alam in response to the state's crackdown, and especially in response to the state's media. In most Muslim majority states, the media is the mouthpiece of the regime. Now, I want to make a distinction between the media in the context of the local jihadis versus media in the context of global jihadis. Local jihadis were more mindful than global jihadis about the power of the media and its negative impact on Dawa. We find Muhammad Abdul Salam Faraj, which Aaron cited in his report, rightfully asking, how can Dawa be widely successful when all means of mass communication today are under the control of the pagan and wicked state and those who are at war with God's religion? So because they were really being suppressed by the state, and therefore the state's media wasn't going to give them the platform. Global jihadis were not as cynical, but they had it easier than the global jihadis. That is because the mainstream media promoted their causes. Abu Mus'ab as-Suri understood the importance of the media, and he was one of the early global jihadis who wrote about the importance of the media. And he recognized, he said, jihad needs money and men, and to get those you need Dawa, and to do Dawa properly you need media. But clearly our media strategy is our sincerity was a rather naive way of a media strategy. Now, the internal documents from the 1980s do not reveal that the jihadis considered the media to be more than a medium. They didn't have really the media strategy that they have now. When global jihadis emerged on the scene, the mainstream media reported their causes. They understood the importance of media, but they thought about it in terms of news. And they focused on getting their news to the journalists so that it would be reported by the mainstream media. They didn't consider that this was a domain that they needed to develop themselves. Of course, they had Dawa classes and training camps to educate the recruits about Islamic ethics and the importance of jihad and so on. But the early drivers for jihadi media was strictly about the media. And it was a question of supply and demand. The documents that I'm going to be referring to are from the 1980s. And I don't know the name of the person who was writing them. It's not listed as part of the documents, but we find them observing that Muslim men were more likely to be incited to take up jihad after listening to a prominent charismatic leader, such as Azzam or bin Laden. But of course, the leaders of jihad could not be available everywhere at all the time. So the next best thing to do was to record their lectures and get the recruits to watch them. So we also learned that at times, would-be jihadis who traveled to Afghanistan to receive training were left days and weeks without training because of shortage of trainers. This shortage, they thought, could be remedied through the use of video recordings in educational and military trainings, so that lectures are recorded and are organized in a structured manner. And the same author went on to propose that we could replicate these educational lectures for military training purposes. For instance, to use videos to teach physical and military training. Physical exercises, he suggested, could be recorded on slow motion as a way of teaching the trainees. And he recognized, of course, you need outdoor training and trainers for advanced military training, but he still contended that basic training could still be provided using slow motion and even, how to use a knife. And in case, the readers dismissed how to use a knife, says, well, that brings about, the skill of using a knife engenders confidence among the trainees, which would grow into something more meaningful on the battlefield. There was, and there is, I kept Khattab's videos out of it because it was a different kind of, it was outside Al-Qaeda, and he was doing things on his own because there were more a different kind of tahrid, the way that he used it. Now, after 9/11, mainstream media continued to report the jihadis' news, but they denied them the ability to shape their own narrative. Al Jazeera's Taysir al-Alumi, who interviewed bin Laden in October 2001, was arrested on charges of supporting Al-Qaeda when he returned to Spain. The group hoped, somewhat naively, that at the very least, Al Jazeera would continue to allow Al-Qaeda to shape its narrative. And for a while, if you remember, Osama and Ayman kept sending their recorded statements to Al Jazeera, but rarely, if ever, were their statements broadcast in their entirety. By the time Western media reported them, their speeches were highly edited, and the excerpts that they put out often painted a seemingly irrational hatred of the West on the part of the jihadis. This effectively prevented Al-Qaeda from having any control over shaping its narrative. And it was regaining that control became the greatest catalyst for jihadis to develop their own media. Media, not just as a medium, but media as a medium. It became a necessity. And that is when the medium became the message. When jihadi groups emerged in various regions, each had its own media arm to produce audiovisual materials that featured the leaders' public statements, transcript of these statements, magazines, anashid, and so on. The new jihadi websites took the form of a genuine media apparatus and began to serve as alternatives to the mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you. Nelly, will you just unshare the screen?
Sure.
Thanks. Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to begin the discussion actually by asking Nelly to take a little bit of what she presented and her understanding of Aaron's paper and offer a few comments on his paper and his findings.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed reading the report very much, Aaron. And I only have few observations and questions. So I read the report, including the appendix that you included, and I also had a look, not a very thorough look, but some of the documents that you released today. I'm curious as to whether the documents mention Waqf, charitable trust, because ISIS doesn't just want to be any state, but the Islamic State. And in classical Islam, Waqf and religious learning and the foundation of mosques, they went hand in hand. I don't think that I could be mistaken, but I don't know of any diwan ad-Dawa in classical Islam. More likely, we'll find them under Waqf. So just this is an observation. But the other sort of, the other kind of more observation is, I know you don't want to generalize, and I think I recognize that you didn't want to generalize, Aaron, about the documents that you worked on versus what is happening everywhere in the land of the Caliphate. But I wonder if I might invite you to say something, because it's one thing to market Dawa to children through ice cream trucks and eating pie contests, which I thought were very, very smart, and I appreciated that, and I'm going to give them credit for that. But it's another to really be writing about Dawa, teaching Dawa, and so on. And I want to be specific here. I was very struck by the documents about the Sharia exam that you included in the appendix, and some of the other documents giving instructions to the imams, what they should be saying in the Eid al-Adha sermon, and what should and should not be said in the sermons. So I get the sense, my observation is, I get the sense that these documents were prepared by people who received secular education and are very far removed from people who have an understanding of traditional Islamic learning. When I come across discussions, whether in jihadi literature or in the mainstream Islamic literature about Aqidah, creed, and jurisprudence, the last thing I expect is trivia-like questions that could be answered with true or false or multiple choice answers. Instead, and we all come across these jihadi texts about what is it, what are the list of texts that you should be reading if you wanted to go, to learn more about Tawheed. But again, even if, let's just assume that they wanna bring us back more into the modern system of teaching, I'd be expecting different kinds of questions, like what did the fuqaha say on this question? Because there's no way of the fuqaha, each faqih would have, each jurist would have would have an opinion, there would be commentaries, there would be, you would, be expecting questions. Was there a consensus amongst the fuqaha on these issues? But the way that they were, that they set these questions and the kind of content, I'd be interested to see whether, and I know you're working on a variety of other documents, to see whether this is just a few typos, recurring typos in one province, or that they were actually used across the board, whether this is the best of what ISIS had on offer.
Aaron, I'm also going to throw in another question that really ties into what Nelly said. Craig Whiteside has asked, how well did the Islamic State fill Dawa roles with qualified personnel? And I think that ties exactly into the point that Nelly was making. So thank you.
In terms of the first point about an al-Qaf or things like that, at least in the documents that were here, it really didn't come up. Again, like I said in the paper, I think it would be wrong to generalize about 19 documents from a certain time period from only 2 wilayat out of 24 wilayat between Iraq and Syria in particular. So I would imagine there might be something there potentially beyond these 19 documents and other documents from this area and or other areas of Iraq, Syria, and maybe even Libya, because as I alluded to in the paper, Libya and the structures that they set up there when they were in control of territory up until December 2016 were essentially a carbon copy of what we saw in Iraq and Syria, since it was essentially an in-house creation of their own group, or however you want to describe it, since it's also a government structure. In the same way that AQAP was sort of an in-house creation of Al-Qaeda Central, versus a lot of other groups that then pledged to either Al-Qaeda or ISIS that had previously been their own group separately and then became a part of it. So it's interesting in seeing that the group that was actually sort of an in-house creation was the most carbon copy in many respects. In terms of the qualifications, in terms of the question of secular education, with Iraq and Syria in particular, we know there was a specific Ba'athist educational system, and they had their own, if you look at Ba'athist literature, going to Michel Aflaq and people like that, they have their own conception of Islam's role within sort of the Arab consciousness, the Arab people, that's different than sort of the theological understanding of historical Islam and the way people actually practice it, or the way that it was historically proffered when there were, theocratic states, for a lack of a better term. So there was sort of a different conceptualization, the way that Islam was used within the Ba'athist conception. And of course, many of the individuals that would be leaders in the group in Iraq and Syria in particular would have grown up under this educational system. So I imagine that even though they are trying to return to some purity from their perspective, obviously their own life experiences would have some form in them as well. And it was kind of interesting, sort of the true and false nature of some of those questions. Especially if it was training people to become imams over time. Of course, maybe it was just an introductory course, so it could have just been very basic on that level. And there might be something more sophisticated at a higher level course, but again, it's harder to know, especially since, as far as I'm aware, they weren't teaching like university level style courses that you'd get in a theological school. But again, maybe more documents would be needed for that, or information from those that actually were living in that territory at that time and what they might be able to say about that. Based off of what we have here, I would think that it's very basic level at most. But again, we would need more documents to have an idea. And going to Craig's question in particular, if you do read the report, there is a section looking at sort of, at least based off of the 19 documents, the preparation of imams and some of the things that they would focus on in the courses for that, as well as some of the questions and answers that Nelly alluded to that are in the appendix, as well as separately as the files on the website too.
Excellent. I'd also like to offer this point in time to remind our audience that this project is a joint project between the Program on Extremism, the New York Times, and our partners at the GW Library and Academic Innovations team. And so thank you to everyone for their hard work. There are currently 81 files, administration files online at this time, and there's many more to come. The documents that have been released focus on Dawa, real estate, ideology, and several miscellaneous files that have been placed online. And what's to come is several documents related to the Islamic police, agriculture, zakat, military, and education. And what we will see, kind of pulling in a little bit of what Nelly and Aaron said, is that there are other aspects of religious education that show up throughout these documents. So not only in the education files, but in the military, we see a bit as well. So how religious officials were embedded with the military. The paper that Craig Whiteside wrote will be coming out in the near future. We'll discuss this as well. And so I think this is the most interesting part, is Dawa provides just kind of one little glimpse into this religious education that was really kind of peppered in throughout all of the departments as well. Nelly, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your work on jihadi media. And you kind of talk about the change from print to online and before and after 9/11. And I guess, where do you think we're going next? So we see the collapse of the Islamic State. We have seen kind of the drop in publications of jihadi media. Where do you think jihadi media is going to evolve next?
So I'll leave the future to Nostradamus, but I'll say something about the past. It was particularly interesting for me to observe that around 2016, the quality of ISIS media really began to deteriorate rapidly. And I did a study for the United Nations that looked at the Arabic, English, and French magazines that they produced. And before ISIS, I used to be a snob. I would only read the Arabic. Whereas with ISIS, I found that their Dawa and Dar al-Islam, they would be producing certain articles in English and French before they produced them in Arabic. And so that was something to note. Except that as of 2016, when they stopped producing Dawa and Dar al-Islam and they started introducing Rumiyya, it was actually, they were translating articles from An-Naba, mostly, and they were putting them in Rumiyya, both in English and in French. The quality, they say, so we see a significant deterioration in their own, in the quality of their output. We saw that as well in terms of the anashid that they used to produce. At a certain point, they were producing important, very moving anashid, and then at a certain focus, Jonathan Pislak actually looked at this more particularly, where he found there was more production of recitation of the Quran, of the surahs, rather than the production of anashid, because these are, all you need is somebody who can recite the Quran, who can do tajweed. But whereas, a nasheed, you really need somebody who can write the nasheed, who can, with all the kind of because they're not allowed to use musical instruments, you have to have these background. So I think we've seen quite a lot of deteriorations in this respect. As far as the jihadi media is concerned at the moment, it is, we all have to be very grateful to Aaron for his jihadology, because we now turn to Aaron's website to be able, not many people can actually track what is happening in terms of the media output. And so because after not just after 9/11, actually, it's in more recent years, because the medium and the message have become one and the same. We've seen Twitter, we've seen Facebook, we've seen jihadi websites. You can no longer have access to them, and that's why they needed to go to the Telegram and to various other outlets in order to bring out their message, because it's the medium is the message, and therefore it is a threat. And so you have government agencies, you have, I think based on if you look at the way, for instance, Twitter is trying to counter extremism, Facebook is trying to counter extremism, Google is trying to counter extremism. They're all doing their bits in order to go after the media, the medium, and the message. And so this is all. I think we're a bit more removed now from the jihadi media in ways that we were not before.
I think that brings up an excellent point also of the triangulation of what I like to call the propaganda primary engagement. So people on chat rooms are posting things themselves or on Twitter, and the administration documents. And I think, when we talk about primary sources, it's not just one of those, it's kind of the triangulation of the three. Excellent. Aaron, I'd like you to discuss, if you would, a bit about Dawa under the Caliphate, how it differed kind of under the Caliphate and the specific control of ISIS versus the front lines. You touched on this in your paper, and I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yeah, so on the front lines, what was interesting is that they would bring people out to them. And I think you alluded to this also, that Craig will get into more in his paper about the military aspects of the administrative documents. So I'm sure he has a lot more details, but essentially they would use these people on the front lines to help reinforce sort of the ideological message of the Islamic State, to make sure that they would sort of stay true to it and continue to fight and have the purity of heart from their perspective to continue to go on. So they're continuously trying to reinforce their particular interpretations and ideology, not just in the day-to-day things, but also when they're trying to fight as well, which illustrates, broadly speaking, how this was very much a totalitarian system in the way that they operated. And you could see in some ways some similarities with the prior regimes that had been in both Iraq and Syria, well, maybe not prior, since the Assad regime is still in control of some territory, but generally speaking, in the territories that ISIS controlled, the regime wasn't there. Sort of that Ba'athist totalitarian too, where there were these minders in many respects, especially when it came to religion and what I alluded to earlier about sort of this Ba'athist interpretation of Islam. But instead now you had sort of this ISIS interpretations being proffered at various levels of society, not just in sort of maybe a traditional way where it was through the mosque in particular.
Excellent, thank you. Nelly, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, so in Aaron's paper, he wrote about women and Dawa, and he touched on some really interesting issues of female education and religious literacy under the Islamic State. Could you add in a little bit about your research on this and how it kind of ties in, either corroborating or disagreeing with the findings that Aaron had?
Okay, so the two reactions that I have about women. First is I've always done the stuff that interested me about gender has always been why women have been excluded, particularly excluded from being part of the being a spokespeople for jihad, and particularly it interested me in terms of why they were excluded from combat. Because defensive jihad allows everybody. It is lawful for everyone to join the battlefield, except that the jihadis, even though they premise their jihad on the basis of defensive jihad, they've excluded women from the battle, and they've not allowed it. So, but in the Islamic State, when I looked at their magazines, I found on the one level there was this, kind of a way that somehow, as if the woman, there was this aura that women somehow would be able to be valid members of the society. But then when I actually looked at how the articles in Arabic, French, and English, how they were reporting about women, they were awfully subjected under the Islamic State. I mean, once you get yourself out of Europe and you get to the land of the Caliphate, it's a completely different matter. So you have supposedly women writing articles, but we don't know who they are. Now, with Al-Bagha, for instance, I know that in some of documents that Ayman has found that she is considered as an ideologue. But to my knowledge, has she ever written anything in IS publications, official publications? I've not come across, not her daughter, being published in IS official publications. So that is interesting, and I've seen that with, as far as IS is concerned, they're really, it's like duping women into getting there, because the way they were reported in their articles, there is absolutely no agency for women under the Islamic State. Now, the biggest surprise for me, well, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise, but on working on the Abbottabad papers, and the ones that were the most recently declassified, was I pick up the first letter, and it is by Siham, so Osama's third wife, and she's writing to her daughter in Waziristan. She tells her, I write to you in haste because I'm working with your father on his public statements. And so Siham, Maryam, Sumaya, their daughters, the two daughters, they had been co-authoring Osama's public statement at least since 2005. And this is something that is I think we didn't know that before, and I was very impressed with the kind of so for instance, to go to my questions earlier and my comments earlier to Aaron. I mean, they were reading impressive. I mean, the kind of curriculum that they were reading at home. We have part of the Abbottabad papers that tell us, the daily schedule of the children, the young and old, the kind of books that they were reading, the kind of poetry that they were reading. This is serious education, and it's not a question of, like, as I said earlier, true or false questions. And I was very impressed and surprised by how Osama valued his wives and his daughters in terms of their input. It's not a question of really being nice to them. He solicited their input. And so we know this from his letters to when his wife that was detained, for instance, in Iran, and when he found out that she was being released, he sends her a letter. Says, I've sent you everything that I've got on my computers. The 10th anniversary of 9/11 is coming up, and I'd like for you to send me any input that you might have. He didn't know whether she's going to be able to join him or not. There is one of the handwritten documents, a 220-page document that is, the CIA has called Osama's journal, but it is really a completely inaccurate description. It is one of the most interesting documents that was recovered, because it really puts together all the family conversations that were taking place during the last 2 months of Osama's lives. And they were really getting together, the family getting together, to write his Arab Spring public statement. And we find him, everything is recorded, whoever, and it was not Osama who's writing it. I suspect it is Maryam, his daughter, who is writing it. And he's asking them, start putting together the ideas. So this really puts us in what happens behind the scene is very different. And this is really, it's not a question of whether women are capable of having ideas. It's just a question of what the group is allowing women to do or not to do.
I think that's such an interesting point. My work has focused extensively on Islamic State propaganda on women as well, and their conceptualization of women's roles. And I always think about the wife as a shepherd in her husband's home, and what the Islamic State's conceptualization of agency is so different from perhaps our conceptualization of agency. So the agency is to come and join the Islamic State. the agency is to encourage the ideology and the education of that ideology to the next generation. These women are told that is your agency, and it's not necessarily agency, and you're not being told you can leave your home. In fact, you're told stay in your home. But in that home, there's this kind of like encouragement of the agency to follow the ideology, and they're shamed into it almost.
So I would say not so much agency. There is no agency. There is responsibility and duty. So your responsibility to go and travel and live in an Islamic State, it is your obligation, your religious obligation to do this and this and that. That is what is expected of you. And there is no agency, neither for men nor for women. It is all an obligation. So that's why when I find the terms being empowerment or agency, it is non-existent as far as the Islamic State is concerned in terms of their official publications. I don't find it anywhere. And I think sometimes it gets romanticized when in reality, they were not even allowed, not only when women were living in their homes with their in-laws, women had to stay in their room because they shouldn't be mixing with the men of their in-laws. So I don't see any kind of empowerment and it was she had to stay in the bedroom, not even in the house, in her bedroom.
Yeah, interesting. I'd like to bring in one of the questions we have from the audience. Aaron, without overdrawing on the findings of these documents alone, can you speak to how the role of Dawa education, mosque administration differed under ISIS and other groups like HTS?
Well, I haven't looked into HTS's administration related to this specifically. However, one of the research projects I'm hopefully planning to look into more next year, at least, is looking at the Salvation government and its administration of parts of Idlib and parts of Aleppo, since HTS backed it as its sort of civilian administration. So maybe by this time next year, I'll have something out related to that. So then can do some more comparison work within the specific paper as well, since I have looked at ISIS governance related to the Dawa and mosques, but also overall in a general sense in prior publications too.
Excellent, thank you. Nelly, for you, if jihadi media is a framework for Dawa, how does that look different on the local and global levels, and also the internal versus external audiences?
So I guess I want to clarify. It is before 9/11, Dawa and media. I mean, if you look, for instance, for the Muslim Brotherhood, the media and the Dawa, they were one and the same. As I said, I didn't come across the term A'lam, media, for the Muslim Brotherhood. When the jihadis came onto the scene, they didn't problematize the term A'lam, media. They understood the importance of the media, but they didn't see it as something that they wanted to develop their own. What we find is that in those 80s documents, they were very concerned about, for instance, reporting what was happening in a specific battle in Afghanistan, that it needed to be summarized and given details in order to send it to journalists to be reported by the Arab media. So this was their understanding of media. It was a medium, and they didn't want to develop it, and they just wanted to transmit it to the mainstream media. The local that I said earlier, and I'm not sure if I understood the question, the local jihadis of the 70s and 80s, they found it very challenging, and they were actually more mindful and more cynical of the role of the state media than the global jihadis, because they were on the receiving end of the states that wanted to put an end to their own local jihads. When global jihad emerged on the scene, it was interesting. The mainstream media, including the state media, they promoted even the causes, and there was an additional benefit for the states to do that because it got rid of all the local jihadis, hoping that they would go and travel to fight elsewhere and away from Egypt and Jordan and so forth. So, but I think what happened, it's not that they don't understand, but they counted on Dawa being part of something else that you did. But as Aaron noted in his report, their main focus was how is it that you want to build other things. But when they approach Dawa, particularly in the training camps, for instance, the main focus that they needed is how to tie Dawa to jihad, which buttons that you wanted to press on that supported jihad. So if you read the Muslim Brotherhoods, for instance, you're going to be focusing quite a lot on culture, on education. Well, the jihadis that wanted everything to revolve around jihad. So the Muslim Brotherhood would want to win the hearts and minds of Muslims. The jihadis want to win the hearts and minds, but also their arms and legs of individuals, because they want them to fight. So yes, of course, they want to educate them. There is no quibble about that. But the importance is you really need to convince the Muslim public that it is their duty to travel and to join the jihad, the global jihad. So this is where it's a question of emphasis.
Excellent, thank you. Aaron, we're gonna throw the last question to you, and it's actually a two-part question. So it's, how do you feel that the files that you were given from the ISIS files fit into the larger collection of what we know in the public domain already about Dawa? And also, how do the messages in the sermons, seminaries, videos, pamphlets, and magazines that are out there, how do they differ?
I mean, again, I think because there's only 19 files, I don't want to generalize, and I'm sure there's a whole corpus of content and information that's in somebody's USB stick somewhere in Iraq, Syria, or maybe Turkey, with a lot more details. But I think one of the things we learn is more the particulars of the day-to-day aspect of it, and the way that they were going about it, and what we were talking about before, and the way that they're trying to prepare to have new imams, or the way that they were trying to build and then furnish new mosques, and sort of more of the mundane. I mean, I think that's the biggest takeaway, is sort of some of the more mundane aspects of governance that wouldn't necessarily show up in a propaganda video because it's not sexy per se, but it's sort of the day-to-day of trying to govern a territory. And I think you see that in other of the ISIS files that you guys will be releasing in the future too. You know, some of the stuff is just boring, sort of figuring out who's putting a chair or a couch in a mosque, or, you know, things like that, which, you know, is interesting of itself, and how they went about it and how they justified it in terms of especially taking content from churches. In terms of the sermons, I mean, I didn't find anything that was out of whack or necessarily different than what they would say previously. A lot of it is sort of just the garden variety ideological or religious interpretations that they would put out in other documents, because it is important to remember that they did have, you know, through the Al-Himma Media Foundation, these sort of little pamphlets about certain specific religious topics. So a lot of them jive with one another, and some of them even were included within the files itself. So you could see how there were similarities, and is one of the reasons why, you know, at least one of the things I feel most comfortable with concluding is that, you know, if you do look at more of the propaganda related to Dawa specifically and their mosques administration, there is sort of this synchronicity between the two in a way that I would imagine there probably isn't with other diwans, or dawaween, I should say, that they had related to more sensitive issues, maybe related to their police and security architecture, military architecture, that they wouldn't want to put out for their own personal and operational security. But nevertheless, I think it just adds another additional point beyond what we know from the propaganda, or some of the documents that Ayman was able to find also from sources in both Iraq and Syria, and therefore triangulating a variety of different sources is important to getting an even fuller picture of better understanding, maybe on a day-to-day basis of what things were like. And I imagine in the future, we'll continue to get access to more documents too over time, just as we have with Al-Qaeda historically, as Nelly has laid out. I'm sure that this is just the beginning, and while it is a great basis for understanding the Dawa and Mosques administration, it's definitely plausible that we'll have even more understanding and information 5-10 years from now.
Excellent. Let's hope so. Thank you. I'd like to thank both of our speakers, Dr. Nelly Lahoud and Dr. Aaron Zelin, for joining us today, and remind our audience to please check out our website, isisfiles.gwu.edu, for primary source documents, as well as Aaron's latest report. To thank our partners at the New York Times and GW Libraries and Academic Innovation. And please stay tuned as we release more ISIS files in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you.